In this third segment on the 1970s, I want to continue with foreign policy. Vietnam was important, but there were other issues on the table. And it was actually in Asia and in the midst of this Cold War thinking, the Cold War mentality, that Richard Nixon displayed considerable skill as a thinker on international relations. Since 1949, the United States had an extraordinarily strained relationship with mainland China. In fact, both the United States and the United Nations had rejected any kind of recognition of mainland China as representing the Chinese people. Instead, Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, had been seen by the West as the actual government of China, not Mao Zedong's communist government. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon will move to change that. They would make what was a belated recognition of what was in effect a reality, and hope that their efforts to open up discussions to begin what we call détente, or sort of a new spirit of openness and cordiality with China, might also benefit them in terms of the peace negotiations with Vietnam. In February of 1972, very unexpectedly, Richard Nixon actually visited mainland China. It's kind of ironic in a way, or it might seem so, because Richard Nixon had for so long been this sort of staunch anti-communist. In fact, he had built his career, his political career, on his struggle against communism. And here, the great anti-communist is actually making friendly with China, communist China. On the other hand, as historians have noted, it often makes perfect sense that someone who has the strongest record of anti-communism would turn out to be the person who could make inroads, see things differently, be trusted to open up relations, to negotiate. Certainly, that's part of what we'll talk about later with Ronald Reagan and the Cold War. But Nixon's playing a really quite brilliant game here, because by going to China, not only does he hope to open relations with this huge economic market, but if he plays nice with China, then he can possibly alter the relationship between a sort of competitor with China, and that's the Soviet Union. A relationship which has been sort of, stuck really since the 1960s. It's sort of like, it's sort of like a triangle in which you sort of seek to make one possible romantic interest interested in you by making that romantic interest jealous. So you actually go and flirt with someone else, hoping that will be noticed and will lead ultimately to a new relationship between you and the person you're really interested in. That's a bit simplistic and perhaps silly, but it does get to the heart of this, which is part of the Nixon strategy here is by opening relations with communist China. He can exploit the divisions that have existed between the major communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, really since the 1960s. And in doing so, then, can possibly alter the relationship with the Soviet Union, which is the major opponent of the U.S. in the Cold War. And it seems like that's exactly what happens. In the wake of his visit to China and the restoration or opening of relations, in May of 1972, Richard Nixon will visit Moscow. And as part of his trip, he will work out with the Soviets an agreement known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT, the SALT Treaty, S-A-L-T, to limit ICBMs, those are intercontinental ballistic missiles, to the existing numbers. Now, this left the Soviet Union with an advantage in the total of number of missiles, but, we had more than enough to pretty much destroy the globe. So, what's a few nuclear missiles among friends? And then also it turns out that the U.S., though we had fewer actual missiles, had more warheads on each missile. So, it's oranges and apples. But this SALT treaty will be a major step in limiting the further growth. Now, we're not pulling back. We're not destroying nuclear missiles at this point, but we're limiting the further growth of nuclear arsenals. The other thing SALT I, as it's called, the first SALT treaty, will do is to limit the capacity of either the Soviets or the United States to develop anti-ballistic missile systems. These are defensive systems that could potentially shoot down your opponent's missiles and thereby give you an advantage. And this becomes part of the talks because now you're limiting the total number of missiles you can have. You're not going to be able to overcome a successful defense with sheer numbers. Another element of foreign policy that will creep into the Nixon administration has to do with something near and dear to U.S. hearts, and that's oil. During the Cold War, much of the focus, even in the Third World, is on the Cold War. Events in the Middle East, events in Asia are seen through that lens. But there's more going on. There's always more going on than meets the eye, the Cold War eye, as we might call it. 1967, in the Mideast, we have the 6 Days War. Israel, the nation of Israel, which is officially founded in 1948, will rout the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and will seize territory. This will, of course, create or extend or accentuate the problems already faced by the Palestinians, many of whom were displaced after the first of the major wars against Israel in 1948. But then during the Nixon administration, there's going to be another outbreak of fighting in October of 1973, known as the Yom Kippur War here in the U.S. Egypt and Syria will attack Israel. It will take Israel very much by surprise. And it takes Israel about 10 days to sort of recover from that shock and to struggle back against the attack. They will counterattack and manage to take a huge, portion of territory, including most of the Sinai Peninsula. And then with détente sort of bubbling, the United States and the Soviet Union sort of cooperate in intervening to stop the fighting. U.S. nuclear power is on alert, and the two ought to be pitted against each other in this Middle East conflict. But it seems, given the new atmosphere, it seems a bit more of a bother, a potential for destroying détente rather than anything that either side might directly benefit from. Now, here's the thing, and this is what really affects the United States domestically. In 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, will start an embargo of oil against the United States. Basically, what OPEC is doing, what especially these Middle Eastern countries are doing in the wake of U.S. support for Israel and U.S. policy in the Middle East, these nations are restricting in a major way the flow of oil, the lifeblood of the American economy, to the United States. The United States had become, by the early 1970s, with our massive cars and our interstate highways, dependent upon foreign oil. The results for the United States will be staggering, and we'll talk about that in the next segment.